In 1835, the site of Melbourne had no gold, no coal, no iron, no harbour anyone had charted, no industry, no capital, and no name. It had a river you could not sail up, blocked by a rock ledge, and a salt lagoon out to the west. 4 years later, there were about 3,000 Europeans living on it. Within a single lifetime, that place was reputed to be one of the richest cities on earth, and for a time, the second city of the British Empire after London. But here is the thing about Marvellous Melbourne. Nothing that made it rich was in Melbourne. The gold was under Ballarat. The money was in London. And in 6 weeks of 1893, 13 of Australia's trading banks, well over half of them, shut their doors. This is the story of a city that was built on things belonging to somebody else. Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian maid, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. A note before we begin. This story contains the names of Aboriginal people who have died, and it describes the dispossession of the Kulin peoples. It is told on the country of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and the Boonwurrung, whose land this city was built on. Chapter 1. The Ledge. Start with what was not there. No gold. That was 100 kilometres inland, and nobody knew about it for another 16 years. No coal worth digging. No iron. No natural deep water harbour anywhere near the site. No timber worth shipping, and a river that ran into a bay so shallow and so wide that ships had to anchor well out and send their cargo in by boat. By any assessment a surveyor of the 1830s would have made, this was not where you would put a city. But it had one thing, and that thing was a rock. Running across the Yarra, roughly where the Queen Street Bridge stands today, there was a ledge of basalt with about a metre of fall over it. A small waterfall. Not dramatic, not much to look at, and it did something that mattered more than gold. It held the salt water back. Below that ledge the river was tidal, brackish, undrinkable, but deep enough to bring a ship into and moor it. Above the ledge, the water was fresh, and you could drink it. That is the whole reason Melbourne is where it is. A city needs deep water to load and unload, and fresh water to keep people alive. And it needs them close enough together that you do not have to cart one to the other. On this stretch of coast, those two things almost never occurred in the same place. At that rock, they did. Melbourne exists because of a ledge of stone in a river, and almost nobody who lives there now has ever heard of it. And it is worth saying that the men who chose it knew exactly what they were choosing. Batman's party did not stumble on the spot. They went looking for fresh water and deep water together, because that is what a settlement needs. And when they found the two of them separated by a rock ledge, they stopped looking. And it was not empty. The Kulin nation had been on this country for something in the order of 40,000 years. On this ground, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung. To the south, along the bay, the Boonwurrung. They fished at that same ledge, took eels from the Merry Creek and the wetlands, and burned the grasslands to keep them open. Across the Port Phillip district, there were perhaps 11 to 20,000 people. They did not call it Melbourne. They called it Naarm. There is one more thing about that ledge worth holding on to. It was not only useful, it was the boundary of the two worlds the river ran through, and the Kulin had been using it as one for as long as anyone had been here. Below it, salt water and the bay. Above it, fresh water and the plains. Everything that happens in this film happens because of where that line fell. And in 1835, a syndicate of graziers from Van Diemen's Land sailed into the bay with a document already written out. Chapter 2. Void and of no effect. John Batman entered Port Phillip on the 29th of May, 1835. He worked his way up the Yarra, stood somewhere near that ledge and wrote in his journal the sentence that ended up on every plaque in the city. This will be the place for a village. Then, on the 6th of June, 1835, somewhere near the Merry Creek, he produced his document. In exchange for roughly 600,000 acres of country, Batman offered blankets, knives, tomahawks, scissors, looking glasses, flour, handkerchiefs and shirts, plus an annual tribute of the same. 8 men made marks on it. One of them is generally taken to be Billabellary, a senior Wurundjeri Ngurungaita, though even that is argued over. Now, why this was not a sale? Nobody in that clearing shared a language. Batman had no interpreter capable of explaining a freehold land transfer, and the concept he needed to explain did not exist in Kulin law, because country is not a thing a person can be separated from. You belong to it. It does not belong to you. What the Kulin men almost certainly performed that day was a tandarum, a ceremony that welcomes strangers onto country and grants them temporary access and safe passage. A courtesy, with obligations attached and an expiry. Not a sale, a welcome. And the identities of those 8 signatories are disputed by historians to this day, along with the authenticity of some of the marks themselves. Then the Crown moved. On the 26th of August, 1835, 11 weeks after Batman's meeting, Governor Sir Richard Bourke issued a proclamation declaring the treaty void and of no effect as against the rights of the Crown. Understand exactly what that meant. It was not voided to protect the Kulin. It was voided because under British law only the Crown could grant or sell land in a colony, and the Crown fully intended to sell this one. The proclamation reasserted terra nullius, the legal fiction that the land belonged to nobody. And then the settlers were allowed to stay. The treaty was illegal. The occupation it produced was not undone. The trespass was, in effect, rewarded, and the only document in Australian history in which Europeans negotiated directly with Aboriginal owners was struck out precisely because it recognised that they owned something. Meanwhile, a rival. The schooner Enterprise, owned by John Pascoe Fawkner, had sailed without him under Captain John Lancy and landed a party of settlers on the north bank of the Yarra on the 30th of August, 1835. Melbourne has argued about which of those 2 men founded it ever since, and has statues to both, and has never settled it. And there is a detail in the proclamation that tells you what the colonial government actually thought it was doing. It applied not only to Batman's treaty, but to any such agreement by anybody anywhere. The problem was never that this particular deal was unfair. The problem was that it was a deal at all, made with people the Crown had decided did not own anything, and by 1839 there were about 3,000 of them. Chapter 3. 4 booms. In 1837, the surveyor Robert Hoddle laid out a grid on the rising ground above the falls. Principal streets 99 feet wide, little streets half that, squeezed in between because Governor Bourke insisted on them and Hoddle disagreed. That argument is why Melbourne's laneways exist. The place was named after the British Prime Minister of the day, Lord Melbourne, a man who never saw it and had no particular interest in it. The Colonial Secretary's first suggestion had been Glenelg, now the shape of everything that follows, because it is worth knowing before we start. Melbourne did not have 1 boom. It had 4, stacked so tightly on top of each other that from a distance they looked like a single continuous rise. Wool, gold, land, banks. The first 2 came out of the ground. The last 2 came out of London. Hold those 4 in your head because the film is going to walk through them in order, and the last 2 are the ones that break it. Boom 1 was wool, and it arrived almost immediately. Pastoralists came across Bass Strait from Van Diemen's Land with sheep, looking for grass, and took up runs across the Port Phillip district on no authority whatsoever beyond having got there. They were called squatters because that is what they were doing. The town went from 177 people in 1836 to about 3,000 by 1839. And this is the part of the story that has to be said plainly. The thing that destroyed the Kulin was not the treaty, and it was not the grid, and it was not any single act of violence. It was the sheep. Pastoral occupation took the grasslands that had been managed with fire for millennia, fouled the waterholes, and brought disease into a population with no resistance to it. Add frontier violence and the collapse was total, and it was fast. By the 1860s, a few dozen survivors from the Wurundjeri, the Taungurung, and the Bunwurrung, led by Simon Wonga and William Barak, were living at Corranderrick near Healesville, on a small piece of their own country, which they had to petition the government to be allowed to have. Corranderrick is worth knowing about for what it was rather than only for how it ended. It was run largely by the people who lived on it. They cleared it, farmed it, ran cattle, and grew hops. And for a period it turned a profit and won prizes at exhibitions. It was, by any measure the colony claimed to respect, a success, which is part of why it was eventually taken apart. And then, in 1851, somebody found gold about 100 kilometres away, and everything changed inside 18 months. Chapter 4. 77,000. At the census taken in March 1851, the colony of Victoria had 77,345 people. At the census of 1861, it had 540,322, 7 times over, in 10 years. The cause was gold, at Ballarat and at Bendigo, from the middle of 1851. In 1852 alone, something like 90,000 people landed at Melbourne, and the scale of what came out of that ground is genuinely hard to hold. Through the 1850s, Victoria produced more than a third of the world's gold. Note the distinction, because it gets muddled constantly. That is Victoria. Not Australia. One colony. The city could not house any of them. Canvas towns spread across the south side of the river in what is now South Melbourne. Thousands of tents in rows, mud between them, no sanitation, no water supply. A shanty city pressed against the edge of a real one. Ships lay abandoned at anchor in the bay because their crews had walked off the moment they touched land and gone to the diggings, and there was nobody to sail them home. And the diggings were not the fortune most of them imagined. The surface gold was gone within a few years, and after that it was deep lead mining, which needed capital, machinery and companies. The independent digger with a pan and a cradle had a window of about 5 years. By the middle of 1855, there were around 17,000 Chinese miners on the Victorian fields. They worked ground that Europeans had already given up on and made it pay. And for that they were given a poll tax on landing, a residence tax, systematic exclusion and periodic violence. And on the 3rd of December, 1854, soldiers and police stormed a stockade at Ballarat and killed at least 22 diggers in about 15 minutes. But here is what Melbourne got out of all of it. The gold did not stay at Ballarat. It came down the road to Melbourne, and Melbourne banked it, shipped it, taxed it, and sold things to the men who dug it. The diggings made a few fortunes. The city made thousands, and a city that size needed water. So in 1857, an English civil engineer named James Blackburn, who had arrived in the colonies as a convict, transported for forgery, gave Melbourne the Yan Yan Reservoir. At the time, it was the largest artificial reservoir in the world, and it ran to the city by gravity alone. The ledge had been enough for a village. It was not enough for this. And the gold did something to the colony's politics that mattered later. It filled Victoria with men who had crossed the world on their own initiative, who had been governed badly on the diggings, and who did not defer to anybody. Victoria got manhood suffrage and the secret ballot in the 1850s, well ahead of Britain. The same self-confidence that built the institutions would, 30 years on, help build the bubble. And then the men holding all that gold money looked around for something to do with it. Chapter 5. The Octopus. In Los Angeles, a generation later, a group of insiders quietly bought dry land in the San Fernando Valley because they knew where a new aqueduct was going to put its water. Melbourne did the same thing with railways, and it did it from inside Parliament. The Railway Construction Act of 1884 authorised a sprawl of new suburban lines across the Melbourne district, more than 60 of them in one piece of legislation. It was known at the time, and is still known, as the Octopus Act. It was promoted through the House by the Minister for Railways, Thomas Bent. Understand why a railway line matters so much more than transport. A railway does not just move people. It converts farmland into building land at a stroke, and it does it on a date that the government chooses and the government knows in advance. So if you are sitting in the chamber that votes the line, you know which paddocks are about to become suburbs, and you know it before anybody else does. And there is a second thing a railway does, which is why the money went so mad. It does not just make land valuable, it makes land valuable in advance, on paper, before a single sleeper is laid. You can borrow against that paper value, buy more land with the borrowings, and borrow against that in turn. The line does not have to be built, it only has to be announced. What followed was one of the great real estate operations of the 19th century. Estates were subdivided and named after railway stations that had not been built yet. Anything within vague reach of a proposed line became a railway estate, whether or not you could see the line from it. Buyers were brought out on free railway passes, given a champagne and chicken lunch under a marquee, and sold quarter-acre blocks in a paddock by an auctioneer standing on a cart. And it worked for a while on the people it was aimed at. Clerks and shopkeepers and tradesmen bought blocks they had seen once, on a Sunday from a cart. Many of them borrowed to do it. A great many of them were still paying for that paddock a decade later, when it was worth a third of what they had given for it. And the names of the men doing it are the names of the government. James Monroe, who became Premier in 1890, Sir Matthew Henry Davies, Speaker of the Legislative Assembly. Thomas Bent, who moved the railways, Benjamin Fink, William Lawrence Beaulieu. Say it plainly, because it is the centre of this story. This was not a group of businessmen lobbying a government, it was a government. And some of those lines were never going to carry anybody. Branches were run out to places with no population and no prospect of one, purely because the estate at the end of them was owned by somebody with a vote in the chamber. Half of them lost money from the day they opened, and a good number were closed and their rails lifted within 20 years. And to pay for all of it, they borrowed from people who had never seen Australia. Chapter 6. Marvellous Melbourne. On the 8th of August 1885, a visiting British journalist named George Augustus Sala published a piece in the Argus, explaining why he had taken to calling the place a marvellous city. The whole city, he wrote, teems with wealth, even as it does with humanity. Marvellous Melbourne. The name stuck for a century, and the city adopted it without a trace of embarrassment. Now the money, and where it actually came from. By 1889, 27% of all deposits in Australian banks belonged to overseas investors. Between 1880 and 1888, the banks roughly doubled their local deposits and quadrupled their foreign ones. Most of that foreign money was small British savers, chasing Australian interest rates that were better than anything at home, placing their money through London agents into a colony they could not have found on a map. Bank advances in Australia went from 34% of the country's annual output to 74%. Now the land. Average central Melbourne land went from £39 an acre in 1882 to £166 in 1885 to £303 in 1888. Annual returns on land ran around 40% and peaked in 1887 at just over 78%. At the very top of it, land in central Melbourne was changing hands at prices comparable to central London. And here is the number that should have stopped all of it. The rent you could actually collect on that land yielded about 2.5% a year. The banks were paying depositors 6%, which means the land was not paying for itself, had never paid for itself, and could only be profitable if the next person paid more than you did. That is not an investment. That is a queue. The monument to all of this was the Royal Exhibition Building, and in 1888 the Centennial International Exhibition held there drew 2,003,593 visits. About 4 times the number of people living in Melbourne. The city ran the largest cable tram network in the world, operated by a single company. It built coffee palaces. It bought lithographs of itself from Charles Troadell and hung them in its own parlours. And it was reputed to be the richest city in the world. That is the title of this film, and it is worth being straight about it. There is no measurement behind that claim. It was a boast. It came from boosters and visiting journalists, and it was repeated until it hardened into fact. So the question this film keeps coming back to: what happens to a city built on money borrowed from the other side of the world when the money stops arriving? There is a thing that happens at the top of every boom, and Melbourne did it as thoroughly as anyone ever has. The city stopped describing itself and started advertising itself. The exhibitions, the lithographs, the coffee palaces, the title of the richest city on earth. All of it was a city telling itself a story about itself, at exactly the moment the numbers underneath had stopped making sense. And in October 1888, the Melbourne banks quietly put their interest rates up by 1%. Chapter 7. 13. The boom turned in 1888 and 1889, and the first domino was not in Melbourne at all. In 1890, the London merchant bank Barings came close to failing over loans it had made in Argentina. The Bank of England organised a rescue, but the effect on the far side of the world was immediate and brutal. British investors stopped sending money to Australia, not slowed, stopped. Which meant that every land bank, building society and mortgage company in Melbourne that had been funding itself on British deposits now had liabilities it could not roll over and assets it could not sell, because the only buyers had been each other. And notice who was exposed. Not the great trading banks first, but the land banks and building societies, the institutions that had taken deposits from ordinary Victorians and lent the money to their own directors against paddocks. Those went first, through 1891 and 1892, and every failure took a little more confidence with it. Then the Parliament did something remarkable. On the 3rd of December 1891, it passed the Voluntary Liquidation Act. The Act allowed a company to wind itself up privately, no public examination, no inquiry into where the money had gone or who had taken it. And it covered building societies, which is to say it covered the institutions holding ordinary people's savings. James Monroe was Premier when that Act passed. Now, the accuracy precisely because this matters. The Australian Dictionary of Biography puts Monroe's role in one careful sentence, and this film is not going further than the record does. Monroe did not initiate the legislation, but as Premier he agreed to it, and then he left. In February 1892 he handed the premiership to his deputy, took the post of Agent General for Victoria in London, and sailed in March. The Federal Bank of Australia, which Monroe had founded, failed on the 30th of January 1893. And on the 5th of April 1893, the Commercial Bank of Australia, the largest bank in Victoria, suspended payments. That is the day the floor gives way. Within 6 weeks, 13 of Australia's trading banks had shut their doors, well over half of them. Between them, those banks held 56% of every deposit in the Australian colonies. 13. The Victorian government declared a 5-day bank holiday from the 1st of May, which is a polite way of saying it closed the banks so the queues outside them would go home. By 1893, 28% of trade unionists were out of work, and probably more than a third of Melbourne's breadwinners had no job at all. One Melbourne house in 10 was repossessed, and around 50,000 people simply left the city between 1891 and 1893. And the depression that followed was not a bad few years. Australian economic output fell by something like a sixth. Prices fell for the rest of the decade. It was longer and deeper than the 1930s would be, and Melbourne, which had risen further than anywhere else, fell furthest, and almost none of the men who built it paid for any of it. Chapter 8. Who paid? James Monroe came home just before Christmas, 1892, to face what he had left behind. He filed his insolvency schedule in February 1893. The court eventually released him, and the reason it released him is the reason this story is not simply about greed. It let him go because it became clear he could not pay any part of what he owed. The man who in 1889 had claimed £250,000 in unencumbered personal assets owned nothing at all. He was a temperance campaigner. He had bought the Grand Hotel and dried it out and turned it into a coffee palace. He was a Presbyterian who would not do business on a Sunday, and he had run for office on his rectitude. His own entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography delivers the verdict better than any narrator could. Though not the worst of the speculators, his failure was more shocking because of his moral pretensions. He was never prosecuted. He died in 1908. There is one more thing to say about Monroe before we leave him, because it is the part that gets forgotten. He was not a swindler who wore respectability as a disguise. By every account, he believed in the temperance and the Sabbath and the building societies as a way for working men to own their own homes. That is what makes the ending of it worse rather than better. Now, the others. Benjamin Fink made a private settlement with his creditors that revealed debts of £1,520,000. His estate paid a halfpenny in the pound. He had already transferred a great deal of property into his wife's name, and he sailed for London. 2 separate attempts to overturn that settlement on the grounds of fraud were settled out of court. He was never charged with anything. Sir Matthew Henry Davies, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, resigned and left for England. He was arrested at Colombo, on the orders of the Attorney-General, brought back to Melbourne and tried for conspiracy to defraud over a false balance sheet. He was acquitted in 1894. Thomas Bent never went bankrupt at all. He rode the Depression out on a dairy farm, came back into politics and became Premier of Victoria in 1904. He was knighted in 1908. So here is the arithmetic of the thing. The depositors, many of them British savers and Melbourne clerks and widows, lost everything they had. Of the men who built it, one was ruined, one fled, one was acquitted, and one became Premier. The Crown Law files on all of it sat forgotten until the historian Michael Cannon found them in a basement 70 years later. 13 banks, 6 weeks, and 1 prosecution that failed, and the city itself did not recover for a generation. Melbourne had around 490,000 people in 1890, and that figure barely moved for 15 years. By 1901, Sydney had taken back the lead, and Melbourne would not hold it again in the 20th century. It is worth being fair about one thing here. Not all of it was fraud. A great many of these men believed the prices, which is why so many of them were personally ruined rather than quietly rich. Monroe genuinely thought he was worth £250,000. The tragedy of a mania is that the people running it are usually inside it too. And yet in that same year, the new nation held its first parliament in the biggest building the boom had ever produced. Chapter 9. 401 Collins Street, on the 9th of May, 1901, the first Parliament of the Commonwealth of Australia opened in the Royal Exhibition Building. A monument to a land boom that had bankrupted its own city, used to launch a country. Melbourne remained the seat of federal government until 1927. And then the Washa, and this is the least told Melbourne story there is. On the 21st of March 1942, General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Australia, having been ordered out of the Philippines. He needed a headquarters and he took a commandeered office building at 401 Collins Street, Melbourne. He was appointed Supreme Commander of the South West Pacific Area on the 18th of April 1942, and for about 4 months he ran the Pacific War from an office block in the middle of Melbourne, before moving north to Brisbane in July. That building is still on Collins Street. Most people walk past it every week without knowing that for a season in 1942, the defence of the South West Pacific was being directed out of it. Around him, the city had become an arsenal. The Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation at Fisherman's Bend built Wirraways, then Boomerangs, then Beauforts and Beaufighters under licence and to its own designs. The explosives and ordnance factories at Marvellous and the ammunition factory at Footscray ran continuously. Marvellous employed over 8,000 people in 1942, and women made up 52% of its production workforce. And in 1939, 89% of the nation's munitions workers were in Victoria. Those aircraft matter more than the numbers suggest. Before the war, Australia could not build a military aeroplane. By 1942, it was building them in Melbourne, under licence and then to its own designs, with a workforce that had been making car bodies and railway carriages 5 years earlier. The city they worked in was under brownout, not a full blackout, but streetlights dimmed and windows covered, which is why the murders committed by an American private that year are remembered as the brownout killings. Slit trenches were dug in the public gardens. American troops were camped at Royal Park. After Singapore fell in February 1942, the fear of invasion in Melbourne was not theatrical, it was reasonable. And the Salt Lagoon on the western edge of the city, the swamp that Batman's men had walked around in 1835, had by now been dredged, filled, and turned into docks and railway yards to handle all of it. There is a symmetry in that which is worth pausing on. The city had been built by British money and British migrants for a British Empire, and in 1942 it found itself housing an American general who was running a Pacific War, because Britain could no longer defend it. The direction Melbourne faced changed permanently in those 4 months, and when the war ended, 1 million people came, and the city they arrived in has been argued about ever since. Chapter 10. The Falls. Post-war Melbourne is the city people still write about in comment sections, 60 years later. Horse-drawn milk carts and glass bottles left on the step with the money under one of them. W-class trams. The Maya Christmas windows, which people queued around the block for. The 1956 Olympics, when the city put itself in front of the world for the first time since 1888. Neon on Swanston Street. And in 1970, 121,696 people got into the Melbourne cricket ground for a single game of football. It is still the record. All of that is true, and this film is not going to sneer at it, but it cannot stop there either. The most watched footage of that Melbourne is a short film from 1966 called Life in Australia. It has been seen well over 1 million times. It is beautiful. It is also completely staged, and it was never pretending otherwise to the people who commissioned it. It was made by the Commonwealth Film Unit for the Department of Immigration to persuade British families to emigrate. The archive that holds it now says so plainly. It was an advertisement. And in that same year, Professor Ronald Henderson of the University of Melbourne conducted a survey of the city and found that 1 Melburnian in 16 was living in poverty. That finding led directly to a national inquiry into poverty in Australia. The White Australia policy was still in force. Women were still routinely dismissed from work for becoming pregnant, and there is not one Aboriginal person in that film. In a city whose traditional owners had been pushed onto Corranderk and then pushed off it when the station was closed in 1924 and its residents moved to Lake Tyers, hundreds of kilometres away. The milk carts were real. So was the one in 16. Both of those are Melbourne, and a film that gives you only one of them is selling you something exactly as the 1966 film was. And one more thing about that 1966 film, which is the reason it matters here at all. The comments underneath it are full of people saying, "That is my mother, that is my street, I am in that photograph." The nostalgia is not manufactured. It is real people recognising a real city. The film was an advertisement and the memories are genuine, and both of those things are true at once. So what is left? The Royal Exhibition Building still stands, the boom's largest monument and the cradle of the Commonwealth. And in 2004, it became the first building in Australia inscribed on the World Heritage List. The Block Arcade is still there. So is the Windsor, the Hotel Munro bought and dried out, which serves drinks again. And the Federal Coffee Palace is not. 560 rooms, built in 1888 by a temperance man who would not allow alcohol in it, and demolished in 1973. Melburnians consistently name it as the building they most regret losing. 3 of its statues stand in a sculpture park. A section of its cast-iron stair rail is in a museum drawer. The lagoon on the western edge is under Docklands and the container terminals. And the ledge, the rock that divided fresh water from salt. The reason a ship could moor and a person could drink in the same place. The only thing that made anybody stop here at all. It was blasted out and dredged away so that ships could get upstream to the wharves the boom had built. There is nothing to look at now. There is no plaque worth the walk. Melbourne grew on gold that was under Ballarat and on money that was in London, and in 1993 both of them stopped. It has spent every generation since finding something else to grow on. The river still runs over the place where the rock was.